Oh man, I got to be honest. There's old Professor White Hot Panic whenever I can't figure out technology immediately because
Oh yeah.
because it's like the difference between okay, you're either going to get your lesson plan done or you just inherited an hour and 15 minutes of nothing.
Yeah, and people get fidgety and they stop paying attention.
And I'll tell you the truth, they used to be cool about it. Like they used to be like very
Not
kind about
anymore.
it, and they would even come up and help me, but now they're not kind about it.
No, because technology is just like inherent to everybody's life now, and they're just like, "What are you doing?" It's like you don't know how to work a microwave, It's
They were
like that
using
level.
touch screens like in the embryo. How's it going, everybody? Kevin, good to see you.
Yeah, the next thing is, do you want the link to see our spreadsheet of questions?
There's a spreadsheet.
Oh, we're fucking organized, man.
So that we can keep track.
I don't know if I want to see the spreadsheet. Oh shit. Yeah,
I think it would just be easier. Like we can read them out for people, obviously, who are just listening. But then I think it would be easier because some of them are a little bit long-winded.
Sure.
Including mine.
Yeah, give me that spreadsheet. Roll me that sweet bean footage.
I resemble that remark, Kelly.
What's that?
I resemble that remark, Kelly. About the long-winded question.
I'm including myself in that, but yes, yours was the worst.
If you listen to me interview people, I can't. You gotta get your thoughts in there. That's how it works.
Yeah, you have to set up the context of the question, right?
You got to. Otherwise, you're Farley asking Paul McCartney. Remember when you were in the Beatles?
Yeah.
Wasn't that great? Okay, where am I going? Where am I looking?
Okay, I put it in the chat.
Okay, let me go look at this. Oh man, these are real questions.
And people who had secondary questions, we put them on the bottom just because we tend to take a while. So we just wanted everybody to get in like one before we try to move on to something like that.
Cool. How's it going, everybody?
Excellent.
Good.
Yeah, going great.
Good. Everyone's so punctual. Jared's here.
Oh, I see. You can show up on time.
Yeah, you just need the right incentive.
See, personally, I'm just terrified that I'm gonna like not figure this out. I was dealing with this at like 6:30. I'll be real with you. All right.
It's a very cute dog, Ken.
Whose dog is River?
That's very cute.
Whose dog is River?
Mine. My dog is River.
What kind of dog is River?
She is a Decker Rat Terrier, so she's a little bit bigger than your standard. She's 25 pounds of twisted steel.
Because they look kind of they look kind of similar, but Twiggy's a Pinscher Chihuahua mix.
Oh, good mix. Yeah.
Which apparently they call a Cheepin, which I think is a terrible missed opportunity to call Pinwawa.
Pinwawa's so much better.
So much better.
I gotta tell you, as the owner of a Chai Weenie, it's my favorite thing in the world to talk about Chai Weenie. Rhyme Chai Weenie, say Chai Weenie. Best.
What's a Chai Weenie?
Half Chihuahua, half Dachshund.
Wow.
Yes. Yes.
Oh my God.
She's something, is what she is. She is the reason why I've had to like make my own little podcast area with like the sound dampening and insulation and everything.
Oh yeah, I haven't seen that background before. I just remember you or somebody else on your podcast saying that the dog like chewed on the baseboard or something. I was like,
well, Beth's done that. I don't know if I talked about it, but she has definitely done that. But this was required. It was like it's like you're interviewing like Jeff Charlotte, and you're like, let's talk about the dangers of Christian. Terrible, bad podcasting.
Now, my wife was like interviewing for a job here at home, and my dog is like super reactive. Anytime a UPS truck comes out, he can hear it down the street and just goes ballistic. I'm just like trying to wrestle this dog downstairs, and she's trying to like land a job.
It's terrible, brutal, and your whole soul is just like, please stop, please. Hello,
hey,
how's it going?
It's so exciting.
Oh, I'm so excited to do this. This was really nice of y'all to read my book and, not pan it on Goodreads or something. That's nice.
1 star, would not recommend. Okay, so what I'm going to do, or what we're going to do, is just try to keep it a little bit orderly, is if you could mostly keep your mic off, that would be great. I mean, right now it doesn't matter because we're just kind of discussing. But we have a spreadsheet of the questions, and we kind of picked an order to say them in. And then, of course, if your question's being answered and do you want to clarify or whatever, feel free to unmute and, respond to Jared about it. Because this is the benefit of this, that there's a little bit of interaction. It's not like a podcast where you just have to send in your questions and listen to the answer and shut up. And then if the people who had secondary questions, if we have time to answer all the first questions and then we have more time, we'll go to the secondary questions. A few people had those. Also, if we have time and you want to be called upon, I know some people either don't turn their video on or they can't use the microphone because of where they are. So I'm going to be taking stack, which we haven't done before, but that just means if you raise your hand or put in the chat, like stack, I'll add you to the stack, which is like a list, and then I'll call on you. But I'll only keep like maybe 4 or 5 people in a stack, because more than that, it gets ridiculous. So if that comes up, just raise your hand or say stack, and I'll indicate that I've put your name down, and then I'll call you at the appropriate time. When there's a break in the conversation. But if we want to start, maybe what I'll do is I'll just call people and you can introduce yourselves. You can either use your screen name or your real name. It doesn't matter, whatever you're comfortable with, because some people don't like being on camera. Just so we can go around the room and say hi. Don't take up a lot of time. And yeah, any other questions? Okay, good. So I'm Kelly. Hi. Hecatron.
Yep, accounted for. Present.
Okay. He's our other moderator. How about Yelena?
Hello.
Is your audio working?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right, Jen.
Hey.
Jennifer, and then Julia. Hey, Julia.
Okay.
All right, and then Ken. That's Ken. Hey, Ken. Kevin.
Hey, how y'all?
Hey. And then Muckrake fan, which I think your name's Caleb.
Yeah, Caleb. Yep.
Hey, Caleb.
Caleb. Hey, Caleb.
Hey.
Amber.
Hey.
Hey, Amber.
Hello. Howard Myers. I think your name's Brittany. I'm sorry if I forget your name.
That's okay. Brittany's good. You got it.
All right. And K-Rock 42.
Hi, Karen.
Hey, Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Hi.
Then Lynn. Hey, Lynn. Oh, yeah, she doesn't usually use audio. And then Teresa. Just making sure you can hear him. Hey.
Hi.
And Tori.
I gotta unmute. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Tori.
And then Jared.
Oh no, that is
I think
dog right there.
Okay, Teresa, I muted you. And then Jeremy also made it.
Very nice.
Okay. Alrighty, so let's start with the questions. I haven't pulled up my spreadsheet yet, but Michael, if you have it, you can.
Yeah.
Start
So
off.
first person is Julia. Julia, do you want to ask your question or do you want us to read it?
She might not remember exactly what. I would have to read my own question.
Oh, you're muted, Julia.
You think I've never done this before? I have a son emergency, so can we just start with someone else?
Yep, you can put it later. We can get you later.
Perfect. Okay.
Cool. That's fine. I just picked an order. Okay, Tori. I can read your question if you want. So
yeah,
Tori,
you'll need to because I can't remember.
Okay, yeah, that's okay. Tori, I am only on chapter 6, and the book is mind blowing. My question: how did you even approach writing this book, given all the interest, given all the reading and research you did, and the notes for each chapter?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me. This is a really nice hangout, and it's making me realize we probably should start opening up some Zoom hangouts, which is something Nick and I have talked about and have wanted to do, and this kind of is spurring that on. I really enjoy this, so thank you for that. And thank you for the question. I got to tell you, I walked into this book knowing that I was going to learn some things that I didn't already know. And I knew it was going to change my idea of American history in a big way. I expected it to be like a chronicling of that, and maybe it would have some revelations here and there. But I have to tell you, literally the very first day that I started this, I picked up Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, which was some of the craziest shit that I've ever read. And actually, it's absolutely insane that isn't taught at a second or a third grade level, and that you are immediately understanding what went into the founding of the country and what the mindset of the founders was. Of course, it's not shocking that that's intentional, that isn't widespread and well known based on what Madison exposes there. But basically, I had to do this as a crash course. I always tell people this and the Midnight Kingdom. Basically, I had to go through my own personal little PhD experience in all of this because I needed to learn each sort of era. I needed to go beyond sort of the conventional history. And as a result, there's really no other way to put this. I worked more or less 3 shifts of writing or research every day. I would get up. Well, to be honest with you, because I'm among friends, I wasn't sleeping very much as I wrote this because of the deadline and the intense amount of pressure. So I would go to bed at night, at 10, and then I would wake up thinking about the book and in an existential panic. Am I not going to meet my deadline? So I would get up at I don't know, 4 or 5, and then just spend a good 7 or an 8 hour writing shift, research shift, just crashing. You know what I mean? Just going after it. And so I had to basically create my own research structure. I showed on Substack one time the method that I do it. I basically have a big giant white legal pad that I keep track of larger ideas, and I had a yellow legal pad where I keep track of quotes. Basically, I keep a running total of that, and the way that works is I sort of kept my narrative mind going and my philosophical mind going while I'm getting those quotes. And that sort of actually created multiple levels of writing and editing, because after I was done researching the chapter, I had to then recalculate the notes that I had made and move them around and rethink them and sort of combine them. And to be honest, the process of it from the very, very beginning was so shocking that I basically reached this point. And I don't know if you all are like this or not. There's like an initial shock of information that you don't know, like whether it's, history or politics or anything else. And then the next thing you know, you're just sort of in learning mode. You know what I mean? And you're just sort of like, I am now going to just learn. And it doesn't matter what you're learning. It just sort of like comes across as information that you need to sort of consume. So for the time it took me to write this book, I was basically moving back and forth between that shock and that learning. And basically, everyone around me got like so many doses of this. I would just be like, "Do you know what Madison said about the Constitutional Convention?" And they're like, "No, dude, I don't. I'm trying to go to work. I'm trying to do whatever." And I'm like, "No, it's completely different than what you think. They didn't have authorization to write the Constitution." And they're like, "Oh, okay, I don't know what to do with that." And I'm like, "I don't either. I don't have a clue what to do with it." And, at other times, I always tell this story. It's like when I found out that Lincoln wanted to sell the freed slaves and like move them off the continent. Like I almost felt like I had been pranked. You know what I mean? Like a trap had been laid for me. Like, wait until he finds this and he's going to tell everybody something wasn't real. And then the next thing I knew, I would move into like a deeper research level, which is where I started interacting with actual like historians, deep historians, and also deep historical writing. And I started to figure out very, very quickly that the conventional history that most of us are taught, and it's even in best-selling books, it's even in documentaries, it's in all this stuff, that there's that deeper level of the other people who are so engrossed in this, particularly specialists. They know that all this is bullshit. They know it, they've studied it, they talk about it in their circles, but they don't really communicate it to people outside of their circles. Because academics, I know this is going to be shocking, mostly only know how to talk to other academics. They have no idea how to sort of write about their stuff or sort of tell people about their stuff. And as a result, I sort of had to start cobbling together deep politics and weave it together in like what I would call an accessible narrative is what I was trying to do. So this was, anyway, I hope my answer betrays the fact that this was a very, very large task that I basically, from moment to moment, chapter to chapter, I would get to the chapter and be like, there's no way I can do this. I'm incapable of doing this. I'm going to have to tell my publisher I can't do this. And then eventually I would learn it, get into the stream of it, and the next thing I knew, I had to do it again. And it was a very, very large, overwhelming process. Midnight Kingdom was that times 5. It's really shocking. Like you keep having to push the boulder up the mountain, and then you just got to push the boulder again. It's a lot.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Hickatronic.
I think your headphones are
Like
on the fritz again. Kelly.
What?
Yeah, you're like crackling again. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, your question's next, is what I said.
Okay, cool. Okay. All right. So I have a bit of a hypothetical or like a thought experiment. A lot of your main characters in the book are people who see the malleability of reality, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Like, George Creel, Vladislav Surkov, Joseph Goebbels. And it seems like the more access to information that we have as human beings, it doesn't mean that truth is any more objective. In fact, I think it's gotten worse. So, leaving aside the kind of the ideas of solidarity and talking to one another that we can do as individuals, what do you think needs to happen at like a corporate level of like corporate media, local, country level government, and maybe even like UN level to try and reach some level of like agreed upon reality? of truth?
That's a hell of a question. Because let's get in the weeds for a second. So first things first, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that has become apparent to me in the past couple of years, because I've had this weird career. Like, I started getting known back in 2016 as I was reporting on Trump rallies, right? Like, for a while, I was sort of like the Trump rally guy. And then all of a sudden, I was like, man, maybe my education didn't do what it needed to do, and I need to start understanding deeper politics and start to get, deeper in the weeds and understand things. And as I did that, one of the lessons that's become increasingly clear is that there's never been objective reality. You know what I mean? Like, that's a weird, bougie philosophical thing. Like, you and I should be smoking pot and talking about the Matrix right now, right? But there's never been objective reality. The question is, when are conditions like the most concrete of objective reality, right? So when do people agree on reality, and who doesn't agree, and how are they kept from disagreeing on reality, right? So we have these moments where reality is much more concrete, right? And it's funny, like, whenever you start actually dissecting when reality is concrete, it is always based on oppression. Right? Which is, if you don't agree with my version of reality, if I'm in power, there are ways I can either make you agree on reality, right? So, like, I can give you financial incentives to agree on reality. I can give you societal incentives, meaning, are you going to be shunned by people? Are you going to be pushed to the outskirts and become a pariah? And also, one of the things I started getting into as I was doing the Midnight Kingdom as well is, that's kind of the basis of psychiatric health. You know what I mean? Like, if you do not agree with our objective reality, guess what? We have a place we can push you. We have medicine we can give you. And then you start asking questions which are, who controls reality? Who is it that decides that is the top, uppermost, most agreeable amount of reality that everybody has to live within? Well, that's when you start breaking down the actual ideas of power. We had a moment on the podcast the other day, and I thought it's really interesting because a lot of what you guys listen to is my relationship with Nick developing. You know what I mean? It's like going back and forth as Nick is sort of learning politics and history because he's sort of the straight man of the podcast, right? I'm the wild-eyed leftist who's coming in talking to his friend and, saying, yeah, I know that's what's happening on TV, but here's what's actually happening materially underneath. And Nick said the other day, he said, you talk about power, but then we end up talking about money. And I think he said something along the lines of, I'm starting to realize that money is a representation of power, right? Which is how we do it. We say that it's a completely, actually going back to objective, the idea that money is objective and the meritocracy, but it's not. It's a representation that takes the onus away from power. So to go ahead and talk about the media or governmental bodies or something larger, I think the answer is this. There's no way for any of those bodies to sit in a room and say, how do we repair reality? You know what I mean? There's no 10-point plan. And every time that they start doing that, you'll know, and I'll go ahead and give you some inside baseball here. I've been working on a project lately, and I've been talking to a lot of, there's no other way to say it, filthy fucking rich people, right? And we're talking about people who are going to donate to projects and things to sort of take this stuff on. And you start having these conversations, and some people get it. They understand. They're like, man, things are really, really rough, and we need to do something about it. Then you have other conversations where they're like, no, common people are stupid. There's no way you can reason with them. You can't educate them. The only thing you can do is manipulate them, right? And manipulation breeds distrust because on a gut level, when you are being lied to or when you're being bullshitted. You don't have to have an education to do that. Like, my family is really uneducated, but they know when they're being bullshitted, right? They know when they're being manipulated or moved along. So here is what I think needs to happen. we're currently in a moment where reality is not concrete at all. I mean, it's liquid. It's really, really malleable and breakable. It's so far away from something that anybody can agree on. And that's actually, I think, one of the most important parts about what's happening in the United States of America. One of the reasons why these conspiracy theories are running wild, and one of the reasons why faith in the media is so low, faith in institutions are so low, faith in politicians are so low, is because they deserve it. Our media deserves people not to trust them. Our politicians deserve people not to trust them. And the reason is because the reality that they're presenting is so obviously see-through. And when it comes to a point where that reality, which is supposed to feel concrete or at least sort of adaptable, when you reach that level, people start looking around for ways to change it, right? And on one hand, they're like, well, I can reform the system, I can do this, and leftists have their own ideas. Most of them have to do with redistribution of wealth or property or power. And then on the right, it's basically, well, we'll blame these people and we'll just go ahead and sanctify it, which is what Christian nationalism is doing and QAnonism, all that stuff. The answer, I think, is to get to something that resembles the lie. The lie, of course, was there's a meritocracy, right? Everybody, if they work hard enough and if they're talented, if they play their role or whatever, they'll make it, right? You can go ahead and you can have the quote-unquote American dream and you can get the house and blah, blah, blah. There's also the lie that our institutions represent people, right? We know that that's not true. We know that our government is bought off and that all these different powers are in place. To get closer to that, you would actually start to see reality become more concrete again, right? Because then all of a sudden, all the manipulations would be the see-through bullshit. But now they seem more real than the illusion that we all know isn't real. What's scary in all of this, and again, the Midnight Kingdom is sort of where I kind of bring this thesis more together. The problem is that when you reach these moments of malleability, that's when change is really possible, right? That's when, like, if people have lost their faith in the gravity of that reality we're talking about, someone who recognizes that can then create the next reality, the concrete reality, the one that we all live within. The right understands this because they're always trying to reinstall these hierarchical powers and oppression. So we are at a moment where that can happen because people are primed for it. The conditions are ready for it. Corporate media can't do it. There's no possibility for them to do it. I actually made the mistake, I don't know why. Tonight was the first night in years that I turned on like NBC News, the nightly news. And their main story was the DeSantis and Abbott stunt from today. They never once mentioned the individuals involved. They showed a child because they want to like pull at the heartstrings, but the whole idea was it was based on, well, this is because of Biden's disastrous southern border policies. And you watch that and all of a sudden you realize, oh, this has all the elements that corporate news is going to profit off of, right? It's old white people who are afraid of how the country is changing. It's people who they want to feel like they care about what's happening, but they don't want to do anything about it. They don't really want anything to change. And you realize that corporate media is not going to work with what we're talking about until they think there's money in it. Or they have a cost analysis and they understand they have more to lose by not doing it. You know what I mean? So right now, the tail is wagging the dog. The media is basically feeding people a story that they hope people run with. At some point, when those conditions shift, the people can demand something and all of a sudden the dog wags the tail, right? It just so happens that our media is moving rightward in a hurry. And that's, I don't know if y'all are paying attention to this or seeing the signs and signals of it. They are accepting this shit and they are just diving into it hard. What I think will happen is maybe somewhere down the road, now I remain an optimist. I understand a lot of this is really hard, but I remain an optimist that these conditions that we're talking about are going to put pressure on the institutions to reform. And there's not going to be a choice because that's always what ends up happening. They recognize that there's an opportunity for the quote unquote left or mass politics to challenge them. And so they reform themselves so they can avoid the massive overhaul. And I think eventually we will get to the point where we don't have politicians anymore who tell us how great America is and Americans can do anything as long as we're together and it's the greatest country on the earth. I think that's going to become, at some point, if this works out, that's going to become a toxic statement that nobody can say and expect to get elected. So I think what is going to happen is it's going to be much more of a bottom up versus top down. I don't think the structures can do it unless they're being pressured to do it. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep, that makes total sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Okay, Julia, are you ready to read your question? Or
Sure. I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to ask it in a kind of simpler way, because I sort of, Jared, I know kind of, I mean, I don't know how you're going to answer this, but I know I've listened long enough and read long enough that I kind of know the storyline, but I sort of want to hear it again of, you know, I know that you started going to rallies, you were writing nonfiction, but it seems like the interest in politics or, you know, all that started before that, possibly like 9/11. And I'm just really interested in the transition. This isn't necessarily specifically just about American rule, but, you know, what, you get what I'm saying? Like what, I don't know. Yeah. Maybe I should read the question.
Oh, no, I took a look at it right before because
okay, cool.
Because if y'all are going to give me a head start on your smart questions, I'm gonna take it. No, and thank you for it. Like the idea of like how I got sort of into this stuff and sort of like the longer sort of focus on it. I got to tell you, so I grew up very, very poor, and I had this weird suspicion as a kid. I knew that something was off. You know what I mean? Like there was my family, I loved them so much. I wanted them to have good lives. And there were always moments where things happened that if the universe was moral, as I was being told at church every Sunday, I couldn't understand why a moral, all-powerful God would make my family suffer. You know what I mean? Like it was stuff like, man, I was thinking about this the other day. I was driving down the road, and I still have this terrible fear that my car is going to break down. Because in my family, the car breaking down was the apocalypse. You know what I mean? Like, if there was going to need to be a repair on my mom's rusted-ass old Escort, like, life was going to end, and there's no way. How would we ever pay for it? So I had this suspicion very, very early on that something was happening that I didn't understand, that there was something occurring that was just outside of my reach. And I went to school. I remember the very first day of kindergarten, I went to school. I came home so upset because I didn't learn how to read on the first day of school, and I didn't learn the secrets. You know, I didn't get the information. And then, of course, I learned how to read, and my grandmother loved books. She had books all over the place, and she basically told me at one point, and I think all the time about my grandmother, and this is part of what opens up the Midnight Kingdom, actually. I think a lot about my grandmother, who was incredibly intelligent but was never educated. You know, she was a depression kid, and she never, ever had a chance in terms of education. And I think about her love of books. And she basically told me all the time the answers are in books, right? She'd point to the bookcase. She'd say, all you need to know are in books, and you go in there. And I started, because I was asthmatic as a kid. You know, I spent a lot of time like hiding away from like abusive stepdads and stuff like that. So like I escaped in books, which is what readers do. Not to speak for everyone here, but basically people who like to read are people who are lonely as children, and they need somewhere to go, and they need friends and family outside of their friends and family. So like I would get in these books and I would study history. And so, like, on one hand, and to go ahead and broaden this out for a second, I would read the Bible, right? Like, I'd read the Bible front to back, and I'd read it multiple times because I kept wanting to know where God came from. The Bible never told me where God came from. There's just a God at the beginning of it, and then there's a God at the end of it. Where did he come from, and what made him? And I was frustrated by that. And then I would pick up history books, right? And they would tell me, Truman did this, Eisenhower did this, and Nixon did this. But then they never told me why. You know what I mean? Like, it was just like, Nixon, I had the Watergate burglars, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, wait, what? Why did this happen? Like, I needed something more. And so I started getting into politics at a very, very young age intellectually because I wanted the answers to why my family and why my town was suffering. I wanted to know why all these things were taking place because I thought, and maybe this is a little narcissistic, I thought I could help. You know, if I got the answer, I could just tell them and we could change things and we'd figure it out. And that eventually led to me like sitting, oh my God, this is so nerdy and I apologize. Like, you know, sitting up watching CNN at like 7, you know, and like watching CNN and then turning on over to like wrestling and then coming back to CNN and like just going back and forth and just like letting this stuff wash over me and trying to understand it. And I would always ask my grandparents for stories and background and historical context and what their lives were. So by the time I reached my teenage years, like my family, I was a weird duckling. My family just always thought I was very, very strange and outside or whatever. And they kept telling me, you know, at some point or another, I was going to be president or I was going to run for office or whatever. And they still thought I was strange. And then by the time I got a little bit older, I started like volunteering for a few campaigns and organizations and stuff like that because I wanted to be near it. You know, I really felt it. And then like you were saying with 9/11, that was another moment where I was like, I want to know what's going on. And I want to know why this happened and why what's happening in the country is happening. The Iraq War in 2003 just threw gas on that fire. And then by the time 2004 rolls around, I was going out to work with the Howard Dean campaign. I ran my dad's disastrous mayoral campaign. And then, you know, by the time all that sort of settled, I walked away from politics until 2016, where I was like, I want to get back into this and see what's happening and maybe even play a role in it in some way, shape, or form. And I guess that has pulled all the way through. I mean, if I could go back in time and tell my childhood self that I'm doing what I'm doing right now, he would be overjoyed. I mean, he wanted to be a writer. He wanted to play some kind of a role in politics and explain things to people. And, you know, I was both fortunate to have the background that I had, the ability to communicate that I had, and also the wherewithal to go to these Trump rallies. And then lightning struck at the same time. You know, it was work and ethic and also a little dash of luck or two. But yeah, I hope that makes sense. That was a weird biography I just gave you.
No, not weird at all. Not weird at all. I loved hearing it. And, you know, what an amazing grandmother that was like, go read. Like, yeah.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. What a weird, wild little woman she was.
And also just that sort of seed was there from such a young age that, you know, we might not use the word like calling anymore, you know, but just a type of like, yeah, like your path was sort of, started really young. That's amazing. Thanks, Jared.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Hearing it kind of afresh and, you know.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't think that I've ever actually told that story in public before. That was really cool. And I got deep in my feels there for a second. I realized all of a sudden I'm picturing little Jared in husky Wranglers and like sitting around reading. That was a lot.
Your husky pants, right, Jared? Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, one thing that we do in organizing a lot is we ask people, how did you get here to where you are now? And how, you know, the things that you believe. And it's very important to sit back and listen to everyone tell those stories because everyone has like a place and somewhere that they've come from and a reason why they are where they are right now.
So one thing that I learned in teaching, and this goes along with it, and this goes into the idea of solidarity, One of the things I learned is the most important thing in the world is if you are going to embark on something, whether it's a class or a movement or an organization, you have to break the spell that everybody else is like a non-playable character. You know what I mean? That they're either there to help you or they're there to impede you. And when you start to realize that other people are human beings and you're sort of into it, so like in a class, as you're going through creative writing and talking about art and stuff, you suddenly realize, oh, I'm helping a human being here. I'm not critiquing art, right? Or an organization, it's, oh, we're actually in this together and here's where we interlock. And it leads to you wanting to do well by them, right? It's not just what I need, what I want in the world, but I want to do well by them. And I want to point out, and maybe this is very obvious to everybody, but I think it's important to say, that is the difference between the left and the right. It truly is. On the left, it's a need for empathy that overrides that when it's at its best and its purest, because that obviously can be manipulated. But you take a look at the right, that's why they're scamming their followers. That's why they're having their followers go in and risk their lives in the Capitol and stuff like that, and why they treat them the way they do. It's literally a perspective that other people are either on my side to help me get what I want, or they're impediments to me gaining what I want. And there's a psychology there that I don't think enough people have researched or written about. But I going to what you were saying, I think that's absolutely essential.
Okay, Caleb, do you want to read your question next? I think you had a creative one.
Yeah, absolutely. 1 second. Oh, am I there? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So I wanted to ask. I've thought a lot about how. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, back. Yeah, so I've thought a lot about how Bill Clinton's embrace of neoliberalism kind of shifted the Overton window so far to the right that we weren't talking about policy, as you'd mentioned,
yeah.
And also about how in that period he kind of cements the golden age of neoliberalism. So my question for you is, I was curious how you think the 90s may have played out if Bill Clinton didn't win and HW got a second term.
Well, yeah, and you know what's funny about that is the 92 election, we kind of treat it now as a fait accompli because, the idea of how could you not vote for the handsome Southerner who played saxophone, and George H.W. Bush didn't know how to, use the scanner at a grocery store. And so we sort of don't take a look at the fact that H.W. Bush's approval ratings were huge. I mean, the Gulf War, and Nick says this all the time, he's absolutely right. If the Gulf War would have taken place like a little bit later, like he would have swept that election with no problem. But there was also an economic downturn. And part of what ends up happening here is in this era, and Reagan, of course, goes ahead and starts this austerity, the destruction of the social safety net. And one of the things that happens, and this is actually one of the reasons why America is in the situation it is now, great powers reach a point where their financial elite don't want to pay for it anymore. They make a ton of money. The system is absolutely helping them, but they don't want to pay taxes to keep it going. So you reach this point again with neoliberalism where Reagan and the people who basically tell him what to do, they starve the system of tax dollars. So you reach this point with H.W. Bush where all of a sudden you have a person who H.W. Bush is one of the most institutional presidents that we've ever had. I mean, this is a guy who, not only got his start with oil, but, was involved in the CIA way before he was the director of the CIA. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And, ends up becoming the vice president and has all these connections. The economic downturn that he dealt with was the hangover from Reaganism. Right? You basically turn everything over to the rich and the wealthy. The economy goes into overdrive, and then all of a sudden you look around and you're like, oh, people can't afford things. Oh, people aren't able to buy into things anymore because all of the money has been accumulated with the wealthy. If H.W. Bush would have won the election, it would have meant that the hangover from Reaganism would not have hit at the exact wrong time. At that point, I have to tell you that Clinton did neoliberalism an incredible favor. And here's the reason why. Bill Clinton put a human face onto neoliberalism. His whole, I can feel your pain, the empathic thing, his ability to take Reaganism and make it human and make it caring, quote unquote, that's what got us like through the 90s, right? Don't worry about politics. Don't worry about what's going on. Believe me, we've got your best interest in heart. And by the way, we'll all be rich. It'll be totally fine. We'll, be at the head of this new global system. I would have to say the Democrats threw labor unions overboard. They threw their traditional foundation of workers, people of color overboard. If Clinton wouldn't have won then, and if he wouldn't have proven the thesis of the DNC correct, you very well could have seen the Democratic Party move left, because there would have been no room on the right. If they wouldn't have co-opted what we now refer to as republicanism, and if they wouldn't have filled in that space, the Democrats would have had absolutely nowhere to go but left. And I don't know who the person would have been. I don't know who the messenger would have been. It very well could have been Jesse Jackson in '96. I mean, Jesse Jackson was breathing down Clinton and the DNC's neck this entire time. It's a really wild hypothetical to imagine, but the Democratic Party would have had to have made some very, very large choices, and the DNC couldn't have made that argument anymore. The election of '92 basically proved the DNC hypothesis correct, but that doesn't mean it was good for anybody. So that would have been wild. Now that I'm thinking about it, what they would have had to have done, and you think about the World Trade Organization protest in Seattle. I mean, that doesn't get much coverage because obviously it's a leftist, piece of action. But you have to imagine that energy that was growing in the left and with people wanting to get back to labor unions and solidarity, there is a very real possibility they could have captured the Democratic Party. That's a distinct possibility. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to be thinking about that. I've been thinking a lot about, I see people in the chat talking about Obama. I've been thinking very much about what the Democratic Party of the 90s and the 2000s represents and what it represented and what it did and the effects that it had. And Clinton was like sort of the consummation between the Democratic Party and moneyed corporate interest. And he was the perfect candidate at the perfect moment. And if he could not have capitalized on that economic downturn, that's a weird, throwing the playing cards on the ground and seeing where they land. That's a really hard hypothetical.
Yeah. There hadn't been a Democratic president since Carter before that, so they were really trying to redefine themselves.
Yeah, I think another really interesting hinge point in all that is Gary Hart. I don't know if you all have come across Gary Hart, but Gary Hart was part of the new Democratic Party, what they call Atari Democrats at some point. Hart was very charismatic. He was also conservative-leaning, pro-market, sort of a technocratic guy. I think him and Obama have a lot in common in that regard. It just so happens that he was caught, in a... I pause to say infidelity because, the circumstances around that are kind of ridiculous. But when you actually compare what he got caught doing compared to what Bill Clinton not only got caught doing, but, was accused of, if he would have come around or if he would have peaked a couple of years later, Gary Hart very well could have taken the mantle. But that party, man, the Democratic Party is so misunderstood in American politics. And I don't know how you all feel about this. And just to, sort of bring it up in polite company, it's really weird to watch the complete misunderstanding of the Democrats on social media. You know what I mean? Like it's these people who and you can support the Democratic Party. My God, vote for them against Republicans, absolutely. But you look at them and it's like people who they just keep beating their heads against brick walls. And they say, "Why aren't the Democrats doing this? Why well, they're the party of the working people and they're this, they're that." And that sort of misunderstanding of what the Democratic Party has become since the late 80s and 90s, it's shocking to me. And I never know exactly what to do with it. I never know how to counter it any more than the work that I do. But it's a really historically important change, is what I would say.
Kevin, yours is listed next. Do you want to read yours or?
Sure. I've got it blown up in big print here. Thanks, Jared, for being here and also for your books and what you do.
Really thank you, Kevin.
So I just completed reading another book, Democracy in Chains by Nancy McLean. She was a guest on the Gaslit Pod, and she explores in depth some of the backstory of James McGill Buchanan and then how his agenda was taken over by the Kochs. And Kochs used their wealth to fund the many facets of the anti-democratic agenda of the wealthy elite minority. And I apologize for reading this, but I'm probably better to read it than improvise. My father's involvement in the Birch Society and the Fundamentalist Baptist Church in the 60s and 70s made this narrative especially interesting. The connections to pseudo-academia were interesting as they moved from UVA to Virginia Tech and eventually settling in at George Mason University in D.C. Yeah. It was both enlightening and frightening to see that this agenda of the Koch machine, the think tanks like the Heritage Foundation that you mentioned in American Rule, is completely focused on individual wealth and property rights with complete abandonment of human rights and social good. And it's especially evil how they use people like my dad as foot soldiers while working to completely abandon them. Anyway, I was just wondering if you had read any of this backstory of the Kochs and the philosophical people that kind of undergirded his agenda in some of your research for American Rule.
Yeah, well, first I just want to say that, as is the case always, I always feel so bad when I hear that people's loved ones get sucked into this stuff. You know what I mean? Like and so actually the Birchers and the Kochs and things like the Powell Memo and that movement you're talking about, that's one of the main narrative threads of the Midnight Kingdom, because I have to tell you, I think one of the misconceptions that people have of this current moment is that this just happened. It's never happened before. We're living in completely unprecedented times. Can you believe so many people believe conspiracy theories and all? And that's not how it works. It's always been the case, because conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking have always been weapons of the wealthy elites. Always. I mean, from the very, very beginning. My book starts in Rome. And that's, it's immediate. It's from the very beginning of modern history. You see that this is a thing that gets moved or that gets used over and over again. The John Birch Society is one of the most consequential groups in American history, period. No one wants to talk about them. No one wants to get in depth with them because of multiple reasons. One, people think it's silly. You know what I mean? That Birchers are ridiculous. And for people who don't know this, Birchers are wild. They truly, honestly believed, and I was reading these Bircher books and pamphlets for the Midnight Kingdom book. Like, they truly and honestly believed back in the 1950s that Eisenhower was an undercover communist agent. Literally think about that now in 2022, right? When it's like Obama obviously was part of Al-Qaeda or this, Muslim conspiracy, or, that Biden is this puppet or whatever. Like, they literally believed that the former supreme allied commander of NATO was a Russian puppet, and that the conspiracy had already taken over the United States. And you look at it and you're like, oh my God, this is ridiculous, right? Then they're making other claims like, the communists and the Jews are using baseball and jazz and women's fashion, to take over the world. And you look and it's absolutely ridiculous until all of a sudden you start to realize, oh, all Alex Jones is doing is peddling Bircher conspiracy theories. And by the way, every now and then he'll slip up in his broadcast and he'll be like, yeah, my dad was a Bircher and I read all of the materials. You're like, oh, no shit. Of course you did. That's where this came from. And you start to realize, and this is something we talk about on the show a lot, the paranoid right says a lot of crazy shit, right? And they just peddle it and peddle it and peddle it. And every day, particularly someone who has a daily show like Alex Jones, they throw everything at the wall to see what will stick. And those of us who know better, we're like, oh my God, can you believe this? They truly think that Joe Biden has been replaced by a hologram or a clone or whatever. And the thing is, some people do. Matter of fact, a lot of people do. And they make incredibly useful foot soldiers for the wealthy, right? Because one of the things that's happening in all of this, the wealthy desperately need an excuse for what's going on. And it's always that they're exploiting people. It's always that they're corrupting these governing bodies, right, in order to help themselves. That's what's at the heart of it. The problem is capitalism and the fact that it allows them to do that through the force of dollars and wealth and capital. But they don't want to talk about that. It has to be an evil thing, right? Some kind of evil giant conspiracy, because that hits a visceral level that people are taught to learn. So like, I grew up in like these really, really radical evangelical circles. So like when I start hearing people talk about satanic conspiracies, even though I'm out of the church, my skin kind of bristles. I'm like, what? Evil satanic conspiracies? Oh my God, where? I gotta, like that framework remains. And America, of course, is very culturally Christian, particularly the right. And what they figured out very, very quickly, and we're talking about PALs going back, the PAL memo back in 1971, I believe it is. And the Kochs, of course, I don't know if you know this, their father was an original founder of the Birch Society, which is not accidental, right? Because it was a lot of very, very wealthy white business owners who formed the Birch Society, right? So the Kochs are coming off of this Powell anti-establishment, anti-intellectualism business, and the Kochs have completely taken advantage of the corruption of higher ed, the corruption of academia, the corruption of specialists, all of these things. And there is a reason why this moment feels the way it does, the reason that it's an echo of this. It works in waves and cycles. I trace QAnon ideas back to ancient Rome. And you just see the same narratives just continue to cycle through. The wealthy and powerful continue to give them new coats of paint to make them culturally relevant, right? The Koch brothers are, I would say, probably, it's really weird to say this, but it's the way that my mind makes it work. You know how, like, men's razors keep getting razors? You know what I mean? And like you look up and they have like 25 blades on them. You know what I mean? And like now they're like electronic, and now they have this and they have that. The Koch brothers were the last model. You know what I mean? They were the last generation of like American oligarchs who were using these conspiracy theories. Now it's moved to tech bros. Right, it's moved to Thiel. It's moved to, Bezos. Undoubtedly, Bezos is funding some shit here and there. Like, they are in a long, long lineage. And to go along with how I started actually answering this, I think it's so tragic that common people get caught up in it. You know what I mean? Because they need answers. They're upset about the way things work, how their own people have been exploited and treated. They need an answer, and these people are the ones providing the answers. And the Koch brothers, I wouldn't even want to know how many billions of dollars they've made just on peddling this stuff, because it's the quickest way to hide what you are complicit in, and it's the quickest way to get faux populists on your side.
All right, thanks. Looking forward to the new book, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I am terrified of this thing coming out. Let me tell you. Oof.
Yeah, I'm reading a book on civil rights movement in Birmingham, the
Oh
history,
yeah.
and the author is from here, and she was talking about trying to figure out her father and the role that he played, and he was in the John Birch Society, and she just kind of mentioned some of the like rich white business owners in her area, sort of participating in that.
Well, and to go along with that, just very, very quickly to add to it, the Birchers held incredible cultural sway as they were beginning because they really played off of the communist panic, the red panic of that era. The Republicans, particularly, and we talked about this on the podcast, the Republicans at the time were definitely country club sets. You know what I mean? They were very, very waspy, intellectuals like Buckley. And they looked down at the Birchers and they said, oh, the
Yes.
Birchers are ridiculous. But eventually they realized, oh, wow, there's not a lot of us. And we can use Bircherism to expand, which, by the way, is how you end up in 2016 with Mitch McConnell, having power in the Republican Party, and suddenly the GOP unable to defend itself from Donald Trump, because the power has moved away from that intellectual waspy country club set, and it's moved now towards that faux populism, which is being wielded by everything from the Kochs to these other billionaires.
Yeah, that's exactly what she was talking about because her dad never really made it in like the high society that like the rest of the family was in.
I add
So
one thing onto
it
that.
was kind of like, yeah,
Well, I want to point out that so much of that right wing idea is based on the idea of, yeah, I may have a lot, but I deserve more than that. Right? So, like, there's a reason why so many of Trump's supporters are like millionaires who are like regional, like barons almost. You know what I mean? Like they have millions of dollars, they have beautiful houses, they have everything that you could ever want in life. But they are so pissed off that they don't have something else, which by the way is one of the reasons why Trump like attracts them so much. This is a guy who was born with all of this money. He's had every privilege in his entire life, but he still feels like something's been held from him.
it's like
Right?
the
That
middle management.
it's middle management. No, you're exactly right. It's middle management, and it's upper management manipulating middle management, who is manipulating the workers underneath them. It's absolutely a superstructure, top down.
Okay, Jen, your question is next, and then I'm going to call on Jeremy after that.
All right, let me find it real quick. Okay. So I grew up Catholic in small town. You know the town, Sullivan.
That must have been interesting to be Catholic
Yes.
in Sullivan, I have to say.
Yes, and just so everybody knows, to have a few Catholics in Sullivan is about as diverse as it gets. So I learned very young that I was different somehow. But I think part of me wanted to fit in, and I was just very curious. So I ended up going to any church I could find, all different friends, all different denominations. I was just interested in how we were different. And I heard a lot of things and experienced a lot of interesting things. I mean, I never saw anybody handling snakes, but pretty close.
Yep.
And there was all that apocalyptic and conspiratorial thinking constantly. And this interest continued through college, and then I kind of let it go for a long time. And so now, after reading your book and Kristen, Jesus and John Wayne, which I'm just going to tell you for book club, we will at all costs avoid saying Kristen's last name. we don't want to mess it up, so we just call her our good friend Kristen. So Jesus and John Wayne, and I never really took them seriously, I guess, and I didn't understand how entrenched religion was in our politics. So that's kind of been a new thing to me, and now I'm seeing some of those more extreme and fringe things that I heard as a kid and in college being spoken, more mainstream, and with more powerful people. And so I guess my question is, how concerned should we be with groups or movements like the New Apostolic Reformation, Dominionism, and all that kind of thing.
Well, I'll say first of all, it's really strange what's happening with Catholicism right now, which is that Catholicism is now partnering with evangelical Christianity in this whole Christian nationalistic endeavor. And one of the and again, like I one of the backbones of the Midnight Kingdom is studying the creation of the Catholic Church, its usage of power, and how it sort of fell out of favor as secularism started to like gain power with liberalism, right? The idea of conservatism is all about getting back to a place where that old concentrated power is in place, right? Which is you have an orthodoxy, which, you know, going back to what Hecatron had said, you get back where that concrete reality is held in power by orthodoxy, right? Oh, we're going to torture you and we're going to interrogate you or we're going to kill you. What's our reason? Well, you're straying from orthodoxy and you've made God mad, right? And God has given me the right to do this. So Christianity, Catholicism, whatever you want to call it or whatever denominations we want to talk about, is such a useful tool because it gives you, and I talk a lot about it in the book, it gives you an excuse between empirical evidence, you know, it's 75 degrees outside, versus subjective and revelatory information, which is God told me to do this, and so I'm going to do it, which you can't argue with, right? So in a way, what has happened is that cultural Christianity, cultural evangelicalism, apocalypticism, it is a what are they called? A shunt. You know what I mean? Where like you like they put a shunt in and it gives you easy access. Like it gives right-wing conservatives a shunt to go ahead and push that authoritarianism that is inherent in these ideas. Catholicism, by the way, like for a while in America, Catholicism was a very cultural institution, right? You go to church, you see your people, you have your community. But lately, you are seeing a lot of right-wingers convert to Catholicism, and they're starting to use the idea of orthodoxy and recreating capital C Catholicism, you know, the overarching sort of orthodoxy, to basically use that as an ideology that helps them create order and that old hierarchy. So the entire point is that we should absolutely be terrified of them, because when we reach points like this, where we start having these societal crises, political crises, people who have that revelatory faith, they are told to expect this their entire lives. I was in those churches you were talking about. I've been in churches when snakes were being handled. I unfortunately to tell you, I was in the pews speaking in tongues, all that shit. Like those moments, they convince you, and it's really sad to say this, but they convince you that you don't matter as a person. It's cult. It's cult-like programming. They convince you that you don't matter, that like all the things that make you are sinful and awful. And then once they destroy your opinion of yourself, they say, but guess what? You can matter if you are a soldier for God. And all of a sudden then it's like, well, I will kill. Like that's the basis of all authoritarian, fascistic, whatever you want to call it. The idea is you can be something if you're willing to die for this cause. And, you know, I don't know if you all saw this. We're probably going to talk about this next in the Tuesday episode of the podcast. You know, there now are these demographic projections that Christians are going to soon be a vast minority in the country, right? They've ran people off left and right with their homophobia and sexism and racism. And that is an apocalyptic situation for them. Right? That is literally what you're all told the apocalypse is. It's you're going to be outnumbered. Satan's going to come after you. Culture is going to be owned by Satan. That is the avenue. It's the shunt. It's the way that they're going to get people to operate within this authoritarian system that they're constructing. Because your mind may say, why am I paid less? Why did they take away regulations in my workplace? Why am I suffering? And then the religion says, because you're doing it for God. You're a martyr. You're holy. It's what makes you important. And that ideology overrides so much shit, and it is going to, if it's not stopped, it's what's going to make this stuff possible. It's basically the gas in the car. Yeah.
That's what I was afraid of. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, unfortunately, me too. I was really shocked when I realized that everybody didn't go to church like I did, and everybody wasn't involved in like all of this bullshit. And then all of a sudden, when everybody's like, "How could the evangelicals support Donald Trump?" I was like, "Oh my God, how do you not know what this is? How do you not understand what's happening in these churches?" But
how long do you have?
yeah.
Yeah, I've said this before, but I found out that my dad went to high school at a Catholic military school with Steve Bannon. They were in German class together. Yeah, and I don't really speak to him anymore, but according to my brother, he said, "Oh yeah, I know him. He's not racist." And I was like, "Well, that means he's racist."
Converted Catholic, Steve Bannon, and there's a
Yeah, that's
reason
so
why he's a
weird.
converted Catholic. Yep.
There's the Catholic TV station EWTN. Its headquarters is like 30 or 45 minutes from me. And somebody told me years ago that there was a bunch of trad cats out there who like wore head coverings or something, and that was all I knew about them at the time.
I have to tell you, I don't ever know how to talk about this on the podcast, so I'm so sorry that I'm excited to talk about it. The fact that the Catholic Church, I mean, the fact that the Pope right now is from the global South is really important, because it's not his policies, it's not his positions. That's what it is. But it's basically a white global North panic that power has moved, that the center of dominion has moved within the religion. And so as a result, you now have, I mean, my God, I really think that they would create an anti-pope if they could. And I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if it continues down this path if they do. But they are literally warring over that faith and that traditional Catholic idea of orthodoxy through oppression and control. That is going to play a massive role in what a lot of these people are trying to see play out.
Yeah, and like Kevin mentioned, there's like social justice Catholics, and then there's like nationalistic Catholics. Basically, that's where it's going now. And I think, like, having gone to a Catholic school, I think there's some people like really freaked out about the whole South American like liberation theology thing and the battles that they had. I mean, they had fascists down there that used the Catholic Church. Also, so it's like not just liberal Catholics down there, but I think there's that exotic like commie panic they're applying to this Pope as well.
I completely agree.
My 2 cents. Okay, I think Jeremy is next.
Hi, Jared. Hey. My question is pretty straightforward. You reference and discuss the noble lie throughout American rule. When you were researching and writing the book, were you already aware of how pervasive the noble lie was through American history, or was it one of those, I need to take a walk around the neighborhood moments?
It really was. I was, man, when I went into undergrad, everybody told me I was never going to make money as a writer. So, jokes on them. And they basically were like, "What are you going to major in?" And like, I was all over the place. Like, I was a psychology major. I had a journalism stint. I sort of waded around in the philosophy pool. And when I don't know how many of you have taken a philosophy class, but it's always very funny the way they talk about philosophy. And they, you'll, depending on your professor, a lot of them, they are just sort of like swimming in the abstractness of ideas, So you get to Plato, and they're just like, yeah, I mean, Plato had ideas about what the ideal society is about. And you're like, I don't know how to say this. This is like straight up fascism, and this is a real issue, And they're like, well, let's talk about the ideas. And it's like, Jesus, God. The noble lie, as I understood it, it was never explained to me that it had heft. You know what I mean? That like it was actually used, or that it would actually ever found application in the world. And suddenly I started to realize, and it was the American Revolution. And here's the thing. I don't know if you've ever heard me do this on the podcast. I really try not to say American Revolution because I don't actually think it was a technical revolution. I think it was a war of independence. And it's hard. I still find myself saying constitutional convention, even though it wasn't a constitutional convention, it was trying to revise the Articles of Confederation. The American War for Independence, when I started investigating the way that it worked and the way that it found purchase and the way that it sort of like culminated and grew, all of a sudden that was sort of a moment for me very, very early on in the writing of this book that I suddenly realized America as an idea was an intentional construction. Right. It was created by a wealth class, like a very, very small minority of powerful elite, that they had to figure out a way to get everybody to go along with it. They had to figure out a way to make sure that they had immediate small revolutions. I wrote about this in the Midnight Kingdom. George Washington, of course, had to he had to marshal an army and go in and crush a rebellion, I believe in Pennsylvania, and that lie, though, that's a religious lie. The idea that America was born out of a desire for freedom and liberty, that's literally a religion. That's literally an idea that there's a spirit that is rolling through this. And maybe you can't see it, and maybe you can't see proof of it, but if you try hard enough and if it's important to you, you can feel it, right? And you can have faith in it. So what I realized very quickly in the writing of this book is that this was a secular religious idea. And philosophically, it played a massive role in having this project continue on unabated. Because to go ahead and say you love liberty and freedom and meanwhile be a nation of slaves, that's incredible. That's the most hypocrisy imaginable. And for a while, I'll tell you the truth, I thought, the thing that you hear if you listen to like a speech by Barack Obama or you watch, conventional history, I just thought that the founders were like flawed guys who just couldn't see what was wrong. You know what I mean? Like they just didn't understand what they were doing wrong. It was of a different time. How can you judge somebody in the 18th century? But no, they absolutely knew what they were doing and what they were peddling. And, the division between Jefferson and Madison and Jefferson and the rest of the founding fathers created a wild opening for the creation of a secular religion. And that's absolutely what this was.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that segues well into my question. The concept of the noble lie pervades a lot of your work, especially here. I recently read A Brief History of Fascist Lies by Finkelstein, and I was struck by his emphasis on both glorious myths about the past and functional lies about the present in the process of fascists establishing power. I'm depressed about how many Americans want to go backward rather than forward. I also think the extreme right's emphasis on America's mythical foundations and Christian fundamentalism has merged into the ideology of originalism. If a form of a noble lie is necessary for coalescing a society around a shared identity and history, like a white lie, so to speak, a noble white lie, what new myths can we construct to move America forward in a positive direction? What can be salvaged?
Well, I'll go ahead and I'll spoil the ending of the Midnight Kingdom for you because that's the only way to actually go about doing this. The necessary noble lie is the creation of a spiritual faith, and the spiritual faith has to do one thing, and it has to do it in a massive way. It has to get rid of the idea of sin. It has to do away with the idea of original sin, the idea that humanity is wicked, the idea that people are inherently flawed, that they're born filthy and lacking, and that they have to find some way, shape, or form to cleanse themselves, whether it's through religion or relationships or wealth or products. And the entire basis of quote unquote Western civilization is that idea that we are ugly, wicked, awful people, and we need to clean ourselves. We need to submit. We need people who are better than us to lead us a certain way. We have to throw ourselves into faiths that tell us that we're wretched, and we have to do our best and then die. The answer is a faith in one another that has been intentionally destroyed. And I'll be honest with you, again, because we're in polite company. I do think that the eradication of national lies, like the idea of nations born from some sort of, like I said this on the podcast the other day. It's like people saying like America is a fundamentally good nation. Well, what's that mean? What are we grading that on? How are we better than other people? No, it's just imaginary boundaries. It's just like these stories that we make up about ourselves. I think the term that I used in the new book I found was exogenesis, which is that like groups of people who come together, they create stories about themselves in order to connect themselves. This is not who we are. Exactly. I think that eventually the great noble lie is this. And actually, and this is something that's been going on in my head. I'll pull back the curtain. I'm working on 2 book proposals right now. And one of them I'm tentatively calling The Long War, which is going to be a history of humanity struggling against like power. And I think that you go through a conflict. You know how like people will go through a war with other people and they feel connected because they went through that struggle together? I think by the time that this thing gets figured out, I think that we will look at this and we'll say, holy shit, look what we were on the precipice of. You know what I mean? Like authoritarianism, oppression, mass suffering. We just went through an incredible trauma together. And look how it brought us together. Look how we were able to like marshal our resources, marshal our energies, and come to trust one another. And I think looking at that almost as if it is a long war, almost as if like humanity has been struggling to free itself since humanity, created politics and power. I think we'll be able to look at that, and it'll still be a noble lie in that it will be a binding narrative, but I think it'll be the truest thing that we've told ourselves, is what I would say. I think at some point, and I say all this, and I know I'm always a bummer. I am so sorry that I'm a bummer. I don't want to be. I feel bad about it. I always get in these interviews, and like if I get on one of these shows, I was just on this Canadian show the other day. And I saw that we were reaching our end, and the host was like, well, we don't want to leave on that feeling. I'm like, I'm sorry. I don't know what to do here, but I remain optimistic. But to be a little bit of a bummer, I think we have to understand that we might not see that victory. You know what I mean? Like, it might come after us. It might come with our children, our grandchildren. I don't know, but we have to, like a religion, we have to hold on and maintain faith that so-called promised land is coming. And if we just keep fighting, and if we keep believing in each other, and we keep striving and trying to be better and try and loose ourselves from these things, that we'll eventually get there. And I think we will. But I think that struggle is what's going to bind us together. And again, I think that'll be one of the true. I think that'll be one of the truest things that we could really come together on.
Yeah, that idea of original sin is interesting. Finkelstein repeatedly said that people were looking for salvation through a leader.
Yeah.
The fascist leader.
Well, and that's the idea, is that, and I wrote about this with, it's not just Hitler, it's Hitler, Cromwell, Napoleon. We always look for signs of a returning Messiah. right? Because we think that we're to a wicked point that obviously we're going to end up in some sort of an apocalyptic scenario if only we can have the second coming show up. And then that desire and that need makes us susceptible marks. It makes us get really, really excited whenever someone comes along and says the right things and embodies the right type of stuff. But it's the quickest way to do it.
Okay, thank you. Ken, your question.
Well, real fast, Ken. I just saw Julia had said I announced my next book. I think that's my book after the next book. So right now I'm working on. I'm thinking about writing a book for the.
Are you working on a nonfiction book, Jared? I mean fiction. Sorry, I meant the opposite. Fiction.
Well, so if you want to be technical, I guess this would be the third book from now. I'm working on a novel. And then I'm working on possibly writing a book for the 25th anniversary of 9/11, which would get into 9/11, the war on terror, and the consequences of it. And then that long war book, which would probably start with the beginnings of human civilization and then come forward.
Oh,
but I'll,
wow.
I'll probably be 50 by the
narrow
time
scope. Yeah.
I don't. I that's a problem with me. I'll be honest with you. I'm bad at that. I'm not good at the narrow scope. So anyway,
Hey, you can talk to Jennifer and I about the Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wingrove.
Yeah, that's a great book. I really enjoyed that book. Well,
it really overlaps with a lot of stuff that you talk about. Actually,
I love that book. I don't think it's an interesting book because it creates. Actually, the amazing thing about that book is it challenges what you know about everything, and it opens up possibilities. You know what I mean? But just a quick anecdote. Like, I started talking to my agent about the possibility of this 9/11 book. I don't know if it's what I'm going to do. We'll see. And he's like, okay, where's this start? Like September 11th? And I was like, no, I think it starts at like the dawning of Islam. And he's like, what the fuck, man? He's like, what are we doing here? And I was like, well, you have
you seen the beginning of Prometheus?
Yes.
China.
You have to start at how Christianity and Islam are two branches of the same Christian faith. And he's just like, God bless, man. All right. So, anyway. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, that's all right. Well, I would like Hecatron to read my question in the style of Alex Jones. So, I don't have it in front of me, but I know what it said. So basically, I had these. I'm older than most of you. I think I'm 55. So I sort of went to prep school and I went to Ivy League school and I learned all these things and I went to all the right places. And then I'm watching Watchmen on HBO and I see the Greenwood Massacre and I'm like, did that actually happen? And then I'm like, how did I not know these things? Like, how did I not know this? And that was, I was already sort of, along the way. But so that was one of those things that I would bring up to people. I would say, okay, I didn't know about this. Like, why didn't I know about this? And so now, of course, anything that's all my, my kids are all reading like Ta-Nehisi Coates and, so anything that's racist based, they all just sort of figure, well, it's racism. It's always been there. It's racism. It's racism. So they think that I'm like the crazy conspiracy theorist in my family because they're the centrist Democrats who like people like Connor Lamb and stuff like that. And I am like, what are you people? And so whenever I start to talk, they kind of roll their eyes and kind of like everybody's doing now. They just kind of go, ah. So my question really was, I think one of the things I always tell my kids when I would start going, they go, well, Dad's a conspiracy theorist. And I'd say, well, it's not a conspiracy theory if there's actually a conspiracy. And so my question for you is, what's the one thing, like I said, it's like an elevator pitch, to get in the room with the people who think if you just get rid of a couple of bad actors, everything will be fine. Like, what's your one nugget of truth, your one thing that you tell people that just goes, okay, oh my God, I am thinking about this wrong. Or, okay, I might as well listen for 5 minutes and see what he has to say.
Well, so first of all, one of the things that I've really enjoyed over the past couple of years. And I've sort of gotten to this point where I sort of figured Twitter out a little bit. You know what I mean? And I've started to realize that like some of my historical lessons go down easier in threads, and like you give little bite-sized things that people can sort of chomp on, and then you start to put these narratives together. One of my favorite things that has happened is I'll do one of these deep history threads, and immediately somebody listen, like 80% of the time it's a Republican voter who comes in and is like, this is a lie, you're paranoid, you're a conspiracy theorist. And then 20% of the time it's a liberal person who doesn't like that I'm pointing out something that happened with the Democratic Party. You know what I mean? I'm talking about neoliberalism most of the time.
What I live in.
Yeah, and they're like, oh, this isn't true. And then, so like, I've always been an outsider in political circles and in journalistic circles. I mean, I'm like a creative writing professor who like tripped and fell into this, and I've been trying to figure myself out since then, right? They don't really like interlopers. They don't enjoy this. So I've always been like a weird sort of, I've never been comfortable in academia. I'm not comfortable around my working class family all the time. I'm not comfortable anywhere except for here. So thank you for that. So then all of a sudden, like, people will come in and they'll be like, this is a conspiracy theory. And then I'm having to watch academics and historians come in and be like, no, technically, it's not a conspiracy theory. This is actually the true history. And I'm like, and I'm going to be honest with you, I do one of these. It's one of my favorite enjoyed things. But I will say, going back to what I was saying, when I found out that so-called Constitutional Convention was basically a low-key coup. And that's the thing. I have to tell you. So I saw this. I read Madison's thing, and then all of a sudden I started a good book. If y'all haven't read, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. It's a really, really good book. I had this moment where, and this I think is absolutely necessary. Oh yeah, the mound builders. That blew my fucking mind. I got in a huge fight with an Andrew Jackson scholar about that. That was, I'll talk about that in a second. So I read this about how they didn't have authority and Madison did it, and then they basically rolled over the existing government. I was like, that can't be right. You know what I mean? I was like, that can't be right. And I started like going and like checking with sources, and I double checked, triple checked, quadruple checked. And all of a sudden I realized that this is just a well-known thing that people don't talk about. You know what I mean? And all of a sudden, like, pieces started locking into place, and that took me on like a completely different path, which is one of the reasons I was able to like construct a different type of history. The mound builders thing. It's incredible because And this is just a tip if y'all want to do your own research and learn about these things. What I have learned is the quickest way to figure out what's actually happening is you find some explanation which is spiritual in manner, right? And again, it's like a paragraph in a book that just tells you something happened, but it doesn't go deeper. So like Manifest Destiny, right? And you all, I assume, have all been taught there's a spirit in America, and suddenly everybody wanted to go west, and they just wanted to conquer the rest of the continent. It was an incredible motivating spirit that made people go. And all of a sudden you're like, no, that doesn't make sense. That's not how things work. People don't wake up one morning and they're like, I'm going to move west and conquer the continent. And all of a sudden you start looking into like all of this bullshit, like the mound builders, the fact that the president of the United States of America believed there was some lost white civilization in the United States of America. And he mentioned it like no less than 8 times. And you start all of a sudden, you look at the poems, you look at the art, you look at the literature of the moment. Everybody is obsessed with the idea that there's a lost white civilization, which, by the way, is part of the reason why you end up getting the Mormon faith, right? It's the idea that America belonged to white people before it ever belonged to Native Americans. So anyway, that's sort of the stuff. And the amount of people that I've just absolutely fried their brains talking to about mound builders, because it is such a wild thing. I had this Andrew Jackson scholar who, like, first of all, if you're an Andrew Jackson scholar, what the hell are you doing?
Why?
What's your world view if your entire life is dedicated to praising Andrew Jackson? It's insane. And he's like, that's not true. And I was like, well, here's documented proof. And he's like, I've never seen this. It's like, what are you doing? What do you mean you've never seen this? And he would be like, there's compelling evidence, but I'm not willing to accept it. And I'm like, you're a scholar. And anyway, long story short, yeah, it fried my mind. And then to sort of get into this stuff, I think that surprises people because all of a sudden you start looking at it and it's like really self-evident, like how this stuff happened and what it did. But yeah, I could rant and rave about that all day long. The amount of shit that like people just don't know about American history is it's unfathomable, really.
Yeah.
But thank you.
No, thank you. This is great. This is a great community you guys have built. It's fun.
And listen, I'm going to be sappy for a second. I always talk about this. It's not bullshit. This is my little this is like my little lagoon. Like the internet and social media is so gross and so destructive and so corrosive. Being able to come and be around y'all are so smart, but also kind and like interested and it's this has meant the world to me. I really can't tell you how much. I don't know if I'd be able to do all this if it wasn't for you guys being so kind and cool, honestly. A canoe or a kayak. I got caught. Yeah. Quick story. I got caught in a kayak in a lightning storm one time. And like I had to lay on like a sandbar for 3 hours. So every time I see the word kayak, I'm just transported into my mind trying not to die.
Yeah, the Smithsonian actually and other institutions like really set back research into Native American cultures and history for a long time because they were run by people who believed stuff like that. The mound builders and other crap. They wouldn't accept artifacts from that were over a certain age because they would just say, "Oh, well, that can't be Native."
Yeah, I there's so much the conventional history, and this is something I talk to with other writers, particularly in the same vein as I am. It pays so much money to be a conventional historian. Like it's just to tell people with money that they're doing the right thing and they come from a long line of people doing the right things. Oh my God, is that just an incredibly lucrative experience? And that's one of the reasons you have a lot of that.
So we got through all of the first questions. I wanted to see if anyone who didn't get a chance to ask one has one that they wanted to, and see if then we have time for we had 3 more questions on the list, but they were people who already asked questions. So.
I just have to ask real quick. This is not a major question, but like Jared, you did the podcast today, and now you're doing this tonight. Like, how's your throat and your voice? Some salt water.
I'm good. What's funny about that is, for whatever reason, lecturing in front of a class really, really knocks it out of my voice. But this sort of conversational thing using a mic, I'm usually okay. I've only had my voice go out in my adult life. Man, I'm setting myself up for failure right now. I'm whistling past a graveyard. I've only had my voice go out as an adult, I think like 3 times, give or take. And one time, I think I recorded a podcast or 2 like that, if I'm not incorrect. But for the most part, yeah, it's been totally fine. I've actually had 3 meetings, a podcast taping, and now this. So
today.
I'm good. Yeah, it's been a busy one, but this is nice. This is just hanging out with good people.
Cool.
You haven't been stuck in that room, have you, all day?
No. I've been,
okay.
I use my office in this room, and I basically have been moving back and forth between the 2, changing locations. You know how it goes.
Oh wait, so I would show Twiggy, but she'll probably snarl at me if I pick her up. She's asleep. Empress Snarlemagne.
I would go back and forth between these 2 rooms all day, and I would take my little dog out, and we rolled around in the grass. And I was just like, this is nice. We don't have to talk in the grass. This is nice.
Yeah.
No, they don't. They just want to be scratched. That's all they care about.
Love ya.
I mean, they loved Hitler. I mean, they were totally fine. Hitler had a lot of dogs that loved him. I mean, they just need scratched.
Well, did you guys see the thing where like the queen had the 4 dogs, and the 2 corgis are going to live with Andrew and Sarah in the building they share as a divorced couple? Like, what happened to the other 2? Like, nobody wants the other 2. Where are they going?
Man, I will be so happy when we don't have to hear about the fucking monarchy anymore. Holy God.
Except now we have to deal with the clown Charles and his pen debacle.
Man, that was something, wasn't it?
I think it was Ken who posted or maybe somebody else who posted the funeral footage with the overlay of the BBC talking about what happened after Kim Jong-il died.
Oh no, it wasn't me. It wasn't me.
Whoever posted that was the best thing I saw all day. We'll have to
watch it.
I like the one that said that called it Morn Hub, the BBC coverage.
No.
You know what? I'll say this. Humanity is a very, very deadly species. We're funny. I think that every day we are so clever.
Especially our gallows humor. We bring it out. It's really hard.
We're very
One of my
clever.
favorite people that I follow on Twitter, and she follows me back. Like, she's been like tweeting all kinds of like really funny shit about like the queen dying, and I'm like, I'm here for it. Like,
I'll be honest. I had this. I'll post something about the monarchy, and then immediately I'm like, it's not worth it. You know what I mean? Like, it's the Twitter is just absolutely algorithmic, like prioritizing like fealty to the monarchy right now, and it's just like they will not let you criticize it, and it's like I've gotten to the point with like something like Twitter. I pick my battles now. You know what I mean? I'm not going to post about the monarchy. I'm not going to post about Marvel movies. I'm done. I can't.
tweeting anything about the monarchy is like kind of like a come at me bro moment. So
yeah,
it's so fucking weird.
It's in a nutshell. Everybody who responds to it is just like, "Hey, I know that the monarchy's done bad things, but this makes me happy, all right?" And it's like, that's kind of the whole nut. You know what I mean? Like that's the whole thing. Like I don't care if people of color and like the global south have been absolutely destroyed. It makes you happy to see a little old woman in jewels. Like that's
all these sad sentient jars of mayonnaise are like, oh, boo-hoo, the queen died. I'm like, okay, cool.
God.
Okay, Caleb, have you read your
cool.
Next question.
All right, great. So I just wanted to say before, since you mentioned like that the community means a lot to you, I just wanted to mention that the level of empathy and also your tireless effort to answer the question why has just been such a profound impact on my life, like your work on masculinity, politics, all of it. And it's answered a lot of questions for me. So I'm just really thankful for you. So
thank you. That means a lot. I got to tell you that book, it's really scary having it out in the world. It's still like even thinking about it being on shelves terrifies the living shit out of me. But that means the absolute world to me. Thank you.
Yeah. So my question was, ever since you and Nick did A Certain Route to Failure and talked about the Malaise speech, it really made me want to look more into Jimmy Carter. And I noticed his, in 2005, he came out for Palestinian rights. And he also wrote a book in 2008 warning of like Christian theocracy, which is what, we were all talking about today. And so what I wanted to ask was, do you think it's simply that his version of Christianity asks too much of us to gain widespread popularity in a neoliberal society? Or do you think there's a deeper reason why his Christianity and liberal Christianity more generally was rejected during his term and seemingly in the subsequent decades since? So
I've been thinking a lot about Jimmy Carter too. I was writing the Midnight Kingdom book, thinking a lot about him. I went back to like ancient Rome. So to go ahead with what we were talking about earlier in terms of like reality shifting and becoming malleable, The reason why Christianity rose to prominence as like the major world religion, particularly in Western civilization, is because there were aspects of it that could be used by the prevailing power structure. So, for instance, in Rome, you had stratified society. You had some people who were better than others, and then you had like a lower class, right? And on top of that, it was a very, very misogynistic society, a very male centric society. And you can use Christianity to explain misogyny, right? I mean, Eve caused the fall of man, right? So, as a result, Christianity was a really easily transferable ideology. I spent a lot of time talking in the book about the cult of Isis. I don't know. Have you all ever heard of the cult of Isis? So the cult of Isis was this. It was a competitor of Christianity, and it was actually wildly popular. But there were some problems. This is the reason why cult of Isis isn't talked about very much. They were really into equality. They were really into egalitarian societies. They were really into science and freedom of expression and human sexuality as being okay. And so as a result, it wasn't palatable to the power structure. You know what I mean? It wasn't something that could be easily sort of transported over the existing power structure of Rome. Jimmy Carter's Christianity is a social justice Christianity. It is an eschewing of consumerism, personal empowerment, personal enrichment. It was radical, to be honest. It was basically going head on against the prevailing ideas of capitalistic Protestantism, which has a lot of Calvinism riddled through it, and the idea that God shows his favor to you based on how much wealth and power you have, as well as Southern Baptist and Southern Baptist religion, which basically is not only white supremacist, but also is all about hierarchies and power from above. He was not useful for those movements. And his rejection, the rejection of Jimmy Carter by the American people, it was less a rejection of Jimmy Carter the person. He has remained incredibly popular. Everybody understands he's one of the greatest ex-presidents maybe in American history. They just didn't want him in charge. They didn't want social justice Christianity or anti-consumerist Christianity to be the focal point. They wanted consumerism. And a large part of why we're in the place that we are is because Americans were given a choice. The choice was, do you want a bunch of shit that is cheap and readily available and you get whatever you want at any given time? Or do you want a society that works? And it wasn't a question for them. It was, I want cheap stuff whenever I want it. And Reagan and those around him and the people he represents, that's one of the reasons that they have all the wealth and the power, is because they were like, yeah, we'll give you cheap shit. I mean, what you want, like absolutely terrible food? You want products that break all the time? Like, fine. The focus on individualism was more or less a movement away from the idea that I am part of a religious community or I'm part of a common faith into I am now the center of the universe. I'm God, right? Which is what right-wing Christianity is. It's the idea that I am God, and as a result, you either give me what I want or you will be dealt with righteous anger. And it was more or less, I would say, a religious schism is what it was. And we don't talk about it enough like that, but I think the divide from Carter to the evangelical right in the 80s and the 90s and what we see now, more or less was a political, economic, socioeconomic, but also religious schism.
Cool. Thank you so much. I'm going to replay this after so I can get it all.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and the last question on the spreadsheet is my second question. It's I'm fascinated by the through the looking glass worldview and myths developed by Surkoff and Dugan. How would you say these methods of establishing a Russian identity and narrative and destabilizing Russia's competitors compared to many of the covert methods that were used by American and Allied intelligence agencies during the 20th century and the Cold War specifically?
They are the exact same.
Is it just a mirror image, one-upmanship for the 21st century, and how is it innovative?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked this question, because this is actually like one of the more nuanced things that needs to be gotten into, and sometimes a podcast or a book doesn't necessarily give you the room, depending upon what you're writing about, what you're focusing on. What Surkoff and Dugan and a lot of these conspiracy theorists who have weaponized these ideologies, what they're actually doing is they're using United States methods against the United States. And on one hand, it's a lot of Americans being like, how dare you do this to us? But meanwhile, it's exactly what's taken place in places where we've fomented coups and overthrows. I mean, it's the exact same thing. That doesn't make it okay, right? But it also, when you start to understand that, and you start to understand that these methods of disinformation and sort of radicalization, when you start to realize that this has always been the case, basically from top down sort of manipulation, all of a sudden you start to realize that this isn't America versus Russia. It's not America versus China. It's actually the powerful versus everybody else. Right. It just so happens that America, because it enjoyed hegemonic status, we didn't have to deal with it. But actually, and this is something I didn't get a chance to talk about completely in the book, and I could bore you all with this for hours. We're actually victims of the empire that we created. Right. So, when we reached the point of American hegemony, when we started creating globalism to push all of our economics out, you start creating the internet, and you actually start to do away with borders, right? You allow people from outside of the country to come into the country through like digital means. What we actually did was we laid the foundation for how to do all of these things, how to foment unrest, how to foment coups and uprisings and radicalization. So actually, in a way, we are getting a taste of our own medicine. We're being treated like a second or third world country is what's happening. And Russia, particularly because they've got a chip on their shoulder based on what happened with the Cold War, and also, how neoliberalism hollowed them out. They were incredibly innovative in understanding that what America had pushed forward, particularly through the CIA and covert operations. They realized that you could rebrand that in the digital age. You didn't need an army. You didn't need secret covert operations around the world. You could simply use the internet and its consumer sort of programming against Americans. You could use their own creations against themselves. It's ingenious. It really, truly is. That's the thing. If you actually want to talk about these people, we can talk about how they're evil. We can talk about how dangerous they are. It's ingenious. And they have figured out our weaknesses. They have figured out our vulnerabilities. And it is absolutely the American playbook that just keeps moving around and moving around. It just so happens that they've taken it to the next level.
Thanks. If you have a few minutes, maybe we could open the floor to anybody to say something that they didn't get to. Otherwise, it's getting kind of late on the East Coast.
I'm so sorry. I can just waste everybody's time for hours. I feel like
we will talk about a chapter of a book and have a book club this long.
So sorry, Shay, you're not allowed. Stop it.
From my background, what I grew up in, I got to be honest with you. It's like one of those things where, and I don't know if anybody else suffers this. It's like if somebody's like, "Hey, you want to hang out?" I'm like, they don't mean that. They don't actually. They're being kind. Like, why would anyone want to hang out with you? I always feel like I'm inflicting myself on other people. So it's just very, very cool. So I appreciate it.
Well, Jared, you're good at talking and sharing. I know that sounds like a put down. It's not. Like, you're good at sharing. Like, you're good. I don't know. When I first came to book club, I was so afraid to speak. I was so shy, But like, the more that you do, the less shy you become. But some people are really good at talking to strangers. I don't know how they do that. But anyway.
For me, it's sheer terror. Like I so the thing is, to be honest, I have like crippling social anxiety. I always have. Like I nearly flunked out of college because of it. It just so happened that by the time I realized I was going to have to make my money being a professor, I sort of had to create a character who would do it for me. Like, there. Yeah, so like that character, eventually I grew into him, and all of a sudden now it's like, I'll go on TV. What the fuck? Why not? And like that somehow or another has made it possible. But you're right, like going in and having conversations and being able to communicate and interact with other people, it really really helps out.
My kids always tell me I'd rather talk
I
to
was
strangers.
trained by Zoom because like I started like I went back to school in 2020 after everything kind of went weird and haywire, but like I got used to Zoom that way because like everything was on Zoom, so it was fun that way. Like, and now I can't even handle going back into like people classes, like if that makes sense, because like
Yeah. We were so isolated that like it got to the point where like you were excited to get on Zoom or something,
yeah, like
for me.
like everyone's like on the computer, so like we can just like talk to each other that way. And I don't know, I don't want to be around people anymore, I guess. I was never a big fan.
Well, and that's the weird thing though, is like you think it's about isolation, but it's actually, I think, about choosing your family. And I always say that, like, coming from like an abusive background, like I never thought that I was eventually going to find like the people that I wanted to be my family or I wanted to be around. And then the internet obviously was like an incredible opening there. You know what I mean? And eventually you get to pick who you want to be around, which is, I don't know, an actual element of autonomy. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. But yeah, I could talk about loneliness and isolation way too long. It never makes for a good podcast topic, is what I would say. Nobody wants to be like, what's going to happen in the midterms, and also, what about loneliness? But maybe we should. I don't
No,
know.
nobody's talking about it, but everybody thinks about it.
I think that's true. I think
I
that's
think
true.
we all think that no one else is lonely but us, But
We're isolated in our thoughts on loneliness.
right.
We are, and I think that goes back to put a bow on it. I think that goes back to one of the reasons why it's so hard to create mass politics, is because when you actually are lonely, you are afraid to tell other people that you're lonely. And so you stay isolated in your loneliness because you're afraid they'll judge you or they'll react terribly to you. But then when you talk to people about your loneliness, you realize that they're lonely and that they have been afraid to talk to you about their loneliness. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, look at us. We're two lonely people who aren't as lonely anymore. And that's actually the basis of the whole thing. Because we get so caught up, and this is, I think, the key to politics and nobody actually wants to talk about. We get so caught up in our own performance and our own existences that we don't spend enough time thinking about whether or not they're real or whether or not they're based on anything empirical or observable or objective. And as a result, we kind of get lost in those performances until they're no longer performances. And people don't like talking about that. It makes them itchy. But I think that's really a fundamental truth that we don't get into enough.
Like the sad and almost kind of scary thing is like I live alone, but I'm not lonely. Like I love being by myself, with just me and my cats, and it's, I don't know, like I feel like I should be like, oh, I need to be out there like trying to interact with humans, but like
it's overrated.
Yeah, we're in the same boat. When I get home, I'm like, I'm so glad nobody else lives here.
Oh, listen, I'm not going to speak another word after this for a long time. Like, this has been wonderful.
I love living alone. It's so cool.
Yeah,
You cry,
there's
heck
so much power in that.
Go ahead, Jared. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say there's so much power in that. The question, and you know, I could rant about this for a while, but I mean, like, really, what we're dealing with in this country is like a mass mental health crisis. And you know, you're sitting there, you're talking about like you feel okay with yourself, which by the way is one of the most powerful things in the world. I always tell students whenever I talk to them, one of the best things that they can do is learn how to go into a restaurant by themselves. You know, go down, sit and eat, or sit at a bar and have a drink by themselves, however they feel comfortable. But to be alone with yourself is incredibly important. It's when the people who are lonely, who don't want to be lonely, but they think that society has somehow or another rejected them, which is all a fantasy. I'm talking about incels. I'm talking about white supremacists. I'm talking about domestic terrorists. Those people are fighting themselves. You know what I mean? They're not actually fighting society. Society hasn't actually done anything to them. What's actually happened is they have gotten so far and so deep in their own fantasy that that ability to be alone and comfortable within it is impossible. And they're constantly fed by demagogues, by grifters, you name it. They're constantly told the problem's not you, it's everybody else. And as a result, they have to inflict damage. I mean, I think that's one of the main root causes of American dysfunction and tragedy right now.
Yeah, we think of ourselves as an individual when we're really wired to be part of a community. Yeah, that doesn't necessarily mean an extrovert, but
Right, it's spiritually. You know, it really like in having grown up in the evangelical circles, I'm always really hesitant to say the word spiritual. But it is spiritual. You know what I mean? Like something like this, and I hope it's the same for you, and hopefully you're not hearing me say this and you're rolling your eyes. But it's like having spent this time with you all, and like you know, I've never met any of you in person. But meanwhile, like I feel a community here. I feel refreshed. I feel re-energized. You know, all of the frustrations that are out in the world, whether they're personal or whether they're communal or societal or political, like being around other people and remembering spiritually that we're all in this together, I think is literally miraculous. You know what I mean? Like one of the things I had to do for Midnight Kingdom is I had to study a lot of philosophy. And Martin Heidegger is a complete and utter piece of shit and was part of the Nazi party. But one of the things that Heidegger always talked about was sort of forgetting not only that you're alive, but that you're thrown into a world where you don't know anybody and you're desperate to find others, you know? But it's also a deep, dark world where if you reveal who you are, you could be destroyed, but you have everything to gain by being honest, which is intimacy, right? Like I'm sitting here talking to you about like my concerns and my insecurities and all of that stuff. Like I have to have faith that you won't destroy me with that. You know what I mean? That like you're not like, oh, I've learned something that I can hold over him or I can manipulate him or whatever. Exactly.
We're gonna call Nick right away.
Exactly. And I got to tell you, that's one of the reasons it was so terrifying for my memoir to come out. Like that, if somebody wanted to read that and decide how to come after me, they could. And like, but there's so much to reward from it. You know, when you'd said a second ago that you appreciated the book, like on one hand, like you said you read the book, I'm like, oh my God. And then on the other hand, saying kind things about it, all of a sudden I'm reminded, oh, there's a reward to being intimate, to being open, to being vulnerable. And in my older age, felt bad to say that. In my older age,
Please.
I'm just learning.
Oh, please.
I've got a lot of miles on the odometer at this point. The Trump years have not been kind to me, I'll say that. But I've learned that there's like an incredible reward there. It's so much better than the alternative, and the alternative is it's nihilism and it's suffering and it's self-destruction, and this is so much better. So that's my long-winded way of saying thank you, by the way. Is what that is.
Thank you. We all appreciate you showing up and giving us your time and, you know, our ridiculously detailed questions for 2 hours.
That was
And
great.
hopefully, when the new book comes out, we'll do this again.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you reading the book. I mean, you always hope that people will, and the idea that people are going to look at it is just its own little miracle. But I appreciate all of you for reading the book and having me in for a talk and listening to me just ramble on and on and on. But again, I say it all the time on the podcast. Like this community really does mean the world to me. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jared.
Thanks, Jared.
All right, everybody.
Thank you, Jared.
Thanks so much.
Have a
Thanks,
good night.
moderators.
Okay?
Bye.
Good night,
Thank you,
everyone.
moderators.
Yes, thanks, moderators. Great job.
Thanks, moderators.
Bye.